Well, hello everyone. This is a little bit of a countdown before we begin the show at 10 o'clock, right on the dot. You'll know that it's a pre-show because there's the little banner right there, and it gives people an opportunity to come into the session. I also wanted to give you guys the plan for today's live stream. Today's live stream is going to be Q&A. And I have a lot of questions that have come in during my break and during the Roots Tech session that I did. And I felt that I needed to spend some time on these questions. So I've preloaded them on some slideshows, going to make it a little bit easier for you to go through some of the questions. But this also is your time. Ask me anything. What are your struggles? What are your challenges? What can I do to help? What would you like to see in the future? Okay. That's what we're going to do today. So if you're watching, I see 2 people have joined already. Just let me know who's watching and where you're watching from. I'd love to hear that. After this stream ends, I'm going to leave it up for about 24 hours. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to download the video, chop it up, and put it into the playlist, because if you know that there's 5 steps to the writing process. First we draft, then we do a developmental edit, then we do content editing, then we format, and then we publish. And so I want to rearrange the different questions that come in from you and from the previous videos. Hello, I see some more people are joining. So glad you're joining. Say hello in the chat. I'd appreciate that. And then once I repap it, I'll reload those. So you will see these videos come up again, but they will be without this intro part, and they will just be organized so that when you have a question or you're like, oh, what was I supposed to do when, you're going to be able to find just that question, and it's going to be on the playlist. However, I'm going to need your support. I'm going to cut them down into short little segments, and if you could watch those again, even though it's a rewatch, and then leave a comment of thanks so much, I really like it, or give more context to the topic, that'd be great. While we're doing this countdown, we have 3 minutes until I take off the pre-show stuff and we start talking questions. I want to say hello to June from New Hampshire. Such a good fan. Hope you're feeling well. You've been sending me lots of healing prayers, and I need them again because I sliced my finger open by trying to make the blender blades go apart. And they wouldn't, and so I slit my finger when I was trying to put it down, and so I had to get 5 stitches. So if you guys see the finger, that's what's going on. And hello, Kimberly from Colorado. Hi. I don't know if you've joined us before. I'm so glad you're here. And to all the rest of you, so glad that you're joining in. We got about 2 minutes. Kimberly, June, tell me what writing projects you're working on. Tell me about any questions you have or a book if you read. Let me know what's going on in your writing world. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for the healing energy and hugs. You're always so reliable about that. Hey, Kimberly, glad it's your first time. How did you find out about the Write Your Family History channel? Were you one who watched a Roots Tech session? Did you stumble into it when you were just on YouTube? Let me know how that happened. 1 more minute to go. More people are finding the live stream. Be sure to say who you are and where you're from. And throughout this session, even though I do have some questions that are from previous interactions, both in Roots Tech and on this channel, and emails that have come in, if you're here, I want to answer your questions. So be sure to drop your family history writing related questions. You can talk about that even includes, how do I organize before I write? What question are you dying to have answered? And let me know all about it. All right, so June says she's working on a dad's story, found some news from his childhood. Oh, great. Now, when you say news has multiple meanings. Does that mean newspapers? Do you mean news story? Fill us in. And you found it during Roots Tech. Oh, I'm so glad. That was a really fun session. Be sure to check the follow-up to that session that was last week. We continue talking about some of the questions you should ask yourself. And I believe it was Linda's story that she submitted. And Linda, I do owe you. I do owe you your actual writing sample. Next week, same time, we'll be back and we're going to do another writing sample that somebody is challenging me to write. So be sure to come back for that. And then June newspapers. Fantastic. What are you using to find newspaper articles? Are you using old news from MyHeritage, which was a new release from MyHeritage during Roots Tech? Is it newspapers.com and they're revamped, researching? Let me know about that. All right. The rest of you, thank you so much for joining. Be sure to get your questions in. Timothy, hey, how are you? You've been such a good trooper while I've been trying to reboot my channel and being patient. Make sure you ask any of the questions that you have. I know you have been waiting anxiously for this channel to restart again, and here we are. So if you're watching for the first time, howdy and welcome to Write Your Family History. My name is Devin Noel Lee, and I want to do just that. Help you learn how to write your family history. I believe anybody and anybody can write about their ancestors, but don't forget your story matters as well. So today we're going to be answering questions from viewers. And if you want to have your question answered, then be sure to attend the live show or drop your questions in the comments, and I probably will either answer it right away or include it in a future Q&A. So it's so good to be with you all. I want to start with a couple comments that people share that I find it very interesting, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to have a discussion with those of you who are in our live audience or who watch a replay. And so what do you think about this comment right here? Are you like Diane? Are you how are you writing? Where are you writing your stories? And what have you learned not to do? In this case, Diane said, I learned the hard way to never do your only draft on Family Search. I did it over a period of year and Family Search lost it. Oh my gosh, I don't even, what a heartbreak to have your stories lost. Now, there can be some glitches that happened, but one of the things that I always try to do with my stories is to have multiple backups. So right now I write in Google Docs, and then I periodically will save a draft to my computer just in case Google goes down or I do something really ridiculous on there. I never really put forth a story onto any of the platforms, WikiTree, Ancestry, and the like, until I know the story is as good as it's going to be right now. Does that make sense? I don't want to run the risk of not having my story disappear. Like that got to be the most disappointing thing, is to have your story written. But where do you guys write your stories? Do you publish as you go? Do you use the different tools on Ancestry and MyHeritage and Family Search, especially in their different memory apps, to write stories and publish them? And can you relate to Diane with losing their stories? I don't think it's exclusive to Family Search, but it certainly is very shocking when that happens. Okay, so in our live audience right now, I love when audience members tell me what they're writing on and working on. I'm writing my ancestors' social history. Yay, social history. I have researched what the voyage from Denmark was like and included his manifest information and the ship information, such as how long the trip took. Congrats. I am so excited. Super, super, super excited. Now, one other suggestion I would give to you, Kimberly, and I don't know if that's possible, but see if there are any newspapers around the time when your ancestor migrated to wherever they migrated to. If it was the United States, check the port where they landed, research the ship, see if the ship ever appears in newspapers and why. The reason why I say this is because my ancestors migrated on the Anne Lang, and when they arrived, they were quarantined for 14 days. Now that we've been quarantined for never mind. Um, we won't talk about that, but I can relate to the quarantine. But can you imagine being on a ship, traveling so many months, and then you can't disembark because of illness aboard ship? The other thing you can use newspapers for is to find out if it has the weather. Like, what was the weather like the day they landed? Some newspapers, especially ports newspapers, they do keep track of the weather because the seamen and the mariners need to know about it. And so you can get in a little extra. So hope that helps. Okay. So going back to the question of where do you write, Kimberly says she writes on Word or Google Docs and you print because you're crazy. I don't think that's crazy. I think sometimes you just have to print it and port it around with you so you can write all over it. Because while I love the commenting feature on Google Docs, sometimes a good old fashioned markup with your handwritten notes is great. So you're not crazy. Totally love it. June had said she writes in Word Doc and Google Docs, and when you're ready, you publish at Lulu. I'm a big fan of publishing at lulu.com. Really love the ability to publish a cheap proof copy and then send it out to relatives, have them mark that up, and before I go to publication. So Timothy writes in a handwritten notebook. There is nothing wrong with that. And in the Roots Tech class, I talked about how you can go old school with papers, and then during the mark up phase, you just get different highlighters, different colored markers or pens to help you signal to you, okay, this is a person question, and this is a different a fact question or a distance question. Really, really use it. Stacy writes in Open Office, but considering switching to Google Docs, and you like to print it out. So many of us are pretty old school. We like to print out our stories because there's just something about actually holding it that gives you another sense of connection. So the follow-up question, because remember, we had talked about how Diane had said she was drafting on Family Search. So the follow-up question that you guys can share, and maybe we'll circuit back to, is when do you share your stories on Family Search, Ancestry, WikiTree, and the other platforms? So that was a great comment. I feel really bad that Diane had to experience that loss. Okay. Now it's you know what I love about the genealogy community is when we get these fantastic tips. So Deanna I'm not sure if it's Deanna or Deanna. I know two people with the same spelling, and one's a Deanna and one's a Deanna. And Deanna is what I'm going to go with. She said, find a grave, and people legacy sites often have histories of the cemetery that would shed light on your ancestor. Now, this comes in really handy whenever you're writing about the death of a loved one. Previously on this channel, June was featured in a writing challenge for her ancestor, the obituary, and then Roots Tech was also an obituary. And while a lot of obituaries come in, you'll see them frequently. I'm trying to space them out and use some different documents that have been submitted to the writing challenge. If you want to be a part of that writing challenge, let me make sure that if the link check the link in the description box, so you'll find a link where you could submit a document and a transcription for use in a future writing challenge. So, yes, grabbing the history of the cemetery is so incredibly important. And there's a reason why you want to check out the history. So I couldn't find a gravestone for my German immigrant ancestor, Joseph Geisler. And it wasn't until I came across a little blurb that had said that the Catholic cemetery, the first Catholic cemetery in Ohio, had been there was some kind of course case, and then the Catholic Church didn't dedicate it properly, and so that cemetery got reclaimed by the city, and then the internments had to be moved over to Holy Cross Cemetery. Unfortunately, not all relatives could pay for that or even knew they needed to do that. And so, unfortunately, when the ground got dug to put a school building on the property, the excavators found a lot of bones. And so, since my ancestor doesn't have a stone in the new location, it's possible he's either buried and underneath the school or the bones were dug up. So that was kind of interesting to say the least. But finding about the history of the cemeteries are important. I know another cemetery where an ancestor was buried. Initially, it was just for colored persons to be buried there. And so you see a lot of African American and even Asian stones in this cemetery, which is kind of interesting. And now it's just anybody in that area of Columbus are buried there. So, yeah, take a look at the two sites that were recommended by our viewer because, oops, I forgot to take that off. You can get a little bit of insight into the cemetery and then go further. See if you can learn even more. So, I'm reading a couple comments. Okay. We have a question for a viewer, and I think this okay. P. Smith, are you Paul? Are you Peter? Are you Phil? Every time I see your name, I think it's Paul because I have a cousin who's a Paul. So if I keep calling you Paul, know that it's not that I don't know what your first name is. It's because I'm thinking of my cousin. And anyway, P. Smith asked, I decided to hire a professional editor for my latest project. What question should I ask a possible editor before I hire them? Let's open it up to everyone. What would you ask an editor? What would you like to know before you start working with them? Now, a couple of things, I don't know exactly how to frame the questions, but it's definitely something I want to know if we can all figure out how to ask it. So the first thing I want to know is what is their reading pace rate? Like, are they a slow reader? Are they a fast reader? Because if they charge by this is my thought process. If they're charging by an hour and they're a slow reader, now I'm being charged more because they're a slow reader, right? So I want to know, I want to find out like how many projects have you done? About how many hours has it taken you to read these stories? That way I can budget properly. The other thing I want to know is what do they typically edit? What type of works do they edit? Do they edit academic? Do they edit sci-fi? Do they edit history? Do they edit biographies? What is their background? Because their bias in editing will come into my work. Other things that I want, I'm hoping they're going to give me syntax things, but I also want to make it clear to an editor, I want you to ask me questions. I don't want you to assume that you know everything I'm saying. So if something doesn't make sense, such as I've talked about this before in the book that I wrote, it's on my back shelf, but it's out of the viewing screen. But in a from metal to rhinestones, a quest for the crowns, my teenage years in beauty pageants, I had people say, what is the pageant stance? What is turn for the judges? What does that really mean? What is the butt glue and why do you use it? Now, if the person has experience, they may just assume another person in an audience would know it. So you want to invite them to say, okay, I want you definitely to highlight something that you're not familiar with. Like, say, explain what the pageant stance is. But I also want you to point out when I'm using jargon type language so that I remember to add clarifying details. Other questions do you guys have? And then I like this one. Do you have experience editing family histories or nonfiction work? So I like that. Family histories specifically, but we're writing in this nonfiction category. The other thing to ask is narrative style. You need to decide, Mr. Smith, if you're writing in the are you writing a narrative and therefore does your editor have narrative experience? Are you writing academically? Do they have academic experience? So you want to line up in that way. If they don't have some of the experience that you would love for them to review, you don't necessarily need to discount them. Just recognize if they don't have the background experience that you're looking for, and this is their first time with your type of writing, then I would expect them to give you a little bit of a discount. I mean, they are spending their time and they like to eat and live indoors. However, if they have a lot of experience, I'm willing to spend them more because I know that they're going to give me a lot of great feedback. If they're not as experienced, then I would like a 10 or 20% discount on their rate because this is a new field. And if it's doesn't go well, I don't want to necessarily have paid a full price. Does that make sense? So talk if you guys have other suggestions on questions to ask, those are the ones that come to mind. Maybe I'll think of some more later. But those are the ones that come to mind right now. Okay. So this isn't a question. But I think it's a great comment that leads to a series of questions. So those of you who are watching, let me know your thoughts. Okay. I'm happy to share my research and stories that I write on Ancestry, but I'm also a little hesitant because I don't know how to keep my work from being taken. Okay, if you put it online, somebody might take it. However, that isn't to say you shouldn't share your work. The reason is that a lot of genealogists and a lot of genealogy research is built because somebody was willing to write and they were willing to share. I look on Family Search and I look in the gallery and I see so many narratives, short family histories, and it'll be in a PDF form and it has the title, it has the author, and then it has the story. I would never want to take it from anybody because I'm so grateful that somebody took the time to write either their story themselves or write about another ancestor. If I was going to leverage it in something else that I wrote, I would definitely cite them. Not everybody is like that, unfortunately. So we do have to balance the age-old question, can I share this and will I be devastated if somebody takes my work? I think that that battle has been raging for decades now, and I don't have a good answer for you. I will tell you some things that I do to share my work and try to keep it together. For one thing, I advocate publishing your family stories and putting them in genealogy libraries anywhere around the country that you can. For instance, again, I talk about the From Metal to Rhinestone book that is on my back shelf. It is in a library in Saline County, Arkansas. Why is it in Saline County, Arkansas? Well, the more libraries you can put your book in, those books can be put on the WorldCat for interlibrary loan. And let's say, heaven forbid, the Saline County Library burnt down. Well, in another library, I have another copy of the book. And then a family member has it in their home and various other locations. So for me, I would rather get our family stories in the most places I can that will preserve the stories. And I worry less about somebody stealing my stories because if somebody gets to know the ancestor that I've fallen in love with, I feel like that's payback. But I know it's controversial. I may not have covered it as fully. Let's open this up for discussion. So Stacy said, what about putting watermarks on your work? I think that could be good. But I also go back to one thought I'm having. I have seen stories put on Family Search, like I said, these manuscripts as PDFs in the Family Search galleries. If enough people know the original source of that work, I feel like people will say, "Hey, wait, you just copied and pasted and put your name on it." Right? Does that make sense? I don't know where it's not a fully developed thought. So one of the things is share your work, because then other people are going to see your work and they're all going to know that your work's there. Watermarks could be good. But I like the way, this is another thought. I really love that June brought up. Yeah, be prepared. Somebody could take it. However, and you said this so well, it can be used as cousin bait. You can find more relatives that way. And not only that, here's another thing to consider. It could also help somebody add social history into their story. So I'm working on this project where I'm trying to research all the members of the Ohio 133rd Volunteer Infantry. And sure, I'm going to write about William James Townsend, but I want to know who else he served in with and what their lives were like. And if somebody shares a story of Gustavus Innes, who is the colonel of that regiment, there could be little details that are going to make my story better, or I'm going to understand the story better. There was also a man who got sick at the same time William was sick. They were on the same little excursion and they came back, and a number of men were all ill. And I want to know about the guy who died. William survived. This guy died. Did they have the same treatment? Did they have the same fallout of their families? What happened? The other thing is, I'm desperately trying to find more about the doctor who performed the Lansing surgery. I want to know what his training was. Was that the best medical care, or was he a total crock? If people aren't sharing the stories, then I can't do this, not necessarily a cousin, but I can't understand the life and times of what my ancestor was. So I hope that's encouraging for you. And yes, some people could take your work, but you could also benefit so many others. So let that guide you. Let me go through one more question, and then I see Diane just put a question in. So keep the questions coming. All right, next one. I have a newspaper interview of my grandfather on his retirement as a mail carrier. Might that be a good first source to start with? It has things from his past I never heard about before this article. Okay, so we talk about which document you should start with. And there was a wonderful discussion in the comment section of the Roots Tech video. And if you're not sure which video that is, I'll put a link later in the description box in case you missed that session. But what is a very good first article to start writing with? Well, I teach, let me see if I can find the slide. Give me just a second. Need to find, all right, here it is. Okay, so I teach that people should write in chronological order. So if you can, I'm going to turn my little pen on right here. So you've got the birth, you've got the childhood, you have early adulthood, midlife, and death. So you write in chronological order, right? But some people say, well, I really want to write in, turn off the pen. Okay. I really want to write in based on the articles that inspire me. Okay, no problem. I was trying to get the laser pointer, and now I've got this thing. I don't know how to make it. I need to stop sharing from that's a new feature that I it's live. Normally, when I make those mess ups, I will often, oh my gosh, I can't get it to go away. Okay, never mind. I'm gonna have to research that, that tool more because see, normally I use this pen up here, and then all I have to do would make the writing go away is, play with this, but now we've got this writing all right, never mind. Okay, so what I was gonna say is that I don't think you necessarily have to start with the birth document and go all the way to the death document. Start with the timeline of the person you're writing about, and maybe oh, I can't. This is so irksome. Okay, so maybe you get the obituary and you start here and work your way back. Maybe you get something in his early childhood and you write about that, and then you go backwards and then you go forward. Maybe you find something here, like this interview that talks about the time period, and then you go back and then you go forward. Anything really matter it is acceptable as a document to start with, but what do you guys think? Let me know in the chat and in the comment section. Do you want to actually start with the easiest or the shortest or the briefest records first and then tag things in? Or do you want something that's more robust and then insert things in? The key point is to write and then arrange things in chronological order in your draft. And then when you get into the editing phase, which I have a playlist called that's basically the development editing phase, what to do after you write your draft. So that's playlist 2 and playlist 3, which is a content editing. The decision you make in number 2 can guide you when you go to number 3 to tell a better story. And so go with the document that inspires you, but then arrange it in chronological order in your draft and then rearrange it when it's time to actually tell the story. Okay, so here's some feedback from our viewers. Stacy has shared her grandmother's story before, and she likes to start with the day her grandmother died as the prologue. But sometimes there is something very interesting in your life you want to open with. So when you're writing, when you get into the editing phase, you will look through the stories and make these judgments. I like that the day she died to lead off the story. She shared it. I can't remember if it was on the Family History Fanatics deep dives for channel members or if it was on this channel, but I do remember you writing about this. And it was powerful. And we went and said, talk about your census and really get us in there. What did the hospital room smell like? What were you crying when you talked to? Was it ugly crying or was it a trickle down the cheek? Like, tell us what was going on. What sounds did you hear? And it was a really powerful hook into her story. And then she went into the life story, and then eventually she needs to circle back. And I think it's a great starting point because Stacy was so close to this grandmother, and you could just feel that when you read Stacy's story. But for others, the death isn't the most interesting. For my grandfather, William James Townsend, my Civil War great grandfather, I find the most interesting point is when he was in the Civil War, he did get this measles and basically hospital gangrene. And so he was blinded, and so he came home. He doesn't have a mom and dad to return to. I still don't know what happened to them with all my research. And he meets somebody shortly after he comes home, and he's injured. I think because I did this massive research, the whole regiment. I think I figured out how he met his wife, or at least through whom introduced them. And they go on to have a big family. And he's a farmer who's blind. I think that turning point is pretty interesting. And so I would start with that. With my grandfather, my actual, one generation removed grandfather, he died when I was 2. but he loved the Ohio State football team. Loved it. He was an usher at the stadium whenever he was driving around town and couldn't go to the football games. He would have it on the milk truck because he was a milkman delivering milk door to door. He would be playing it. And so for me, when I started doing the social history research, I discovered guess what was starting to be developed the year he was born? The Ohio State football stadium. And shortly after my grandfather died, the famous coach Woody Hayes, or at least famous for Buckeyes, Woody Hayes, his career is over in a bit of a scandal. My grandfather didn't live to see that happen, so he went to his grave with Woody Hayes being the most successful Ohio State Buckeye football coach to that point in their history. And so for me, I started his story with Ohio State Stadium being built, and then I tied him into it, and then I wrapped it up with a little football history at the end. So there are so many options, but what you start with is always going to be what's the most interesting for you. So I'm going to go actually back to the question about this interview. If you like the interview, make sure you transcribe it, make sure you save that transcription somewhere, and then absolutely take it apart, rearrange it so that it flows well. If you have some comments that somebody says directly, since this is an interview, put those in quotes so we can hear their voice, and then absolutely add it to your story. Okay, so Diane has a different story. She was talking about starting with her grandfather's time in a children's home, working back then forward. Absolutely. Absolutely. This is probably the most powerful technique in writing. In genealogy, too often, somebody was born and then they had a childhood and then they had an early adulthood and then they died. And it just keeps following that same flow over and over and over again. But if you find an interesting point, start there. But Diane, let me make this suggestion. Don't fully flesh out his time in a childhood home. Just give us a little bit, then go back, bring us to that point, share the rest of the story, and then go on. And then as a conclusion, just circle back. You could then say, lessons learned. Did he overcome his childhood trauma in the home, or did the childhood home bless him for then on after? So it is this flash forward, flashback, and circle back technique. You try that, and your story isn't boring because we all want to write non-boring family histories, and it's a fantastic tip right there. Okay, let me look at my next question. I want to make sure that I turn off the laser pointing. Let's see. There was a question from Diane. Is it best to write one short story at a time or a full family narrative? This question depends. So if you're watching, could you drop a depends or an exclamation point in the comment section? Because honestly, it depends. It depends on how much writing experience you have, how many resources you have, and what your limitations are. Okay, so let's go through those. Let's type them really quick. It depends on writing experience. What's the second one I said? Writing experience. How many documents do you have? And forgive me, I'm typing without my first finger. It makes it really hard. How many documents you have and your limitations. Okay, so let's talk about each of those, all right? First things first. How many documents? No, not first thing first. Writing experience. So if you've never written before, or if you think you're a terrible writer, I'm going to recommend that you write a smaller project rather than a larger project. Smaller projects are usually focused on one person and one event in their life. And guess where that starts? It starts with one document about that event in their life. Once you have done that, it's kind of like the Dave Ramsey snowball effect, or how do you eat an elephant one step at a time? You got to start with something small, and then you expand, and then you expand, and then you expand, because a lot of what you have from that first momentum of writing that story will build to the next. Additionally, once you've written about one ancestor from start to finish of their life, when you write about their spouse, you already have a good portion of their story already written. You just have to flip the focal person. So instead of talking about George, now you're going to talk about Emma and the marriage through her perspective, if you will, of being a narrator on her shoulder, following her around through her life instead of on George's shoulder. Does that make sense? If you have more writing experience, then go ahead and tackle a family. Recognize sometimes the family story is going to be taking individuals and inserting them together. And so one chapter you'll start with Emma as a child, and then you'll do George as a child, and then you bring them when they're meeting each other, and then now they're together moving forward. But oh wait, the George's mother came to live with them, or Eveline's Emma Eveline, her deceased fiance's mother moved in with them. So now you got to have a chapter about the deceased fiance's mother, which would have been her mother-in-law, but he died before they got married. And then the mother-in-law helped George and Eveline to get married. So she'll show up in that how they met story. But then when she moves in, then she can be a part of, you see what I'm saying? But you got to write the stories about an individual, and then you overlay it with the family. So the more experience you have, the better it would go. So short or long, the first question is going to be answered based on how much previous writing experience you have. So next, how many documents do you have? Okay. Now, how many documents you have? If you were writing about somebody in the 1980s who died in 2014, you could have a lot of documents, or you could have very few. However, when it comes to the social history, you might not need to add very much, especially if you're from the same town. But when you're writing about a German immigrant ancestor who migrated to the United States and only left 4 documents behind, well, you're not going to have a very long story unless you augment with social history. And then you're starting to answer questions such as, why would have this German have moved from an unspecified village, but the dukedom of Baden, or I can never say Duchy. I always get stuck. But anyway, the duchy or the duchy of Baden, right? Why would he go to America? Why would he go to Ohio? Why would he go to Ohio when he's a single man who's Catholic and marry a chick who's Lutheran? And all of that in the 1860s. So the story can get longer depending on how much social history you want to add into the story and how many documents have. The more documents you have, your story will probably be longer. And then we have limitations. Now, these are limitations such as tools, timelines, goals that you have, maybe personal health, maybe work-life balance. What are the limitations you have? Now, if you have an entire year to work on a project, but you get sidetracked like a certain someone because she's trying to add even more social history, I really do need some limiting factors so I can actually write William's story, and then I can add more details later, because it can always be a second edition, right? But you need to pay attention to what your limitations are. Additionally, where are you trying to publish it? So I talked about this on this channel before, or at least over on the flagship blog, Family History Fanatics, in the writing content. When I talked about the Stars in Our Family Tree project by the Southern California Genealogy Society, their limit was a 600-word hard stop story about an ancestor. So that could be another limitation. That's going to lend itself to a short story. But if you can write until the story's done, then maybe you'll go for a little bit longer story. The final limitation is a decision that's made after you finished your draft. And that is in the second phase, the developmental phase of deciding who is my intended audience. I often think it's best to write anything and everything possible in the drafting phase. And then when you say, oh, I think this little part of my ancestor's life is really interesting and kids would really love this story. Well, you just said kids, your audience would be kids. They tend not to like really long stories. But that doesn't mean then you could also write a second book that has more of the life of that ancestor and have a longer story. So when we get back to the question, is it best to write one short story at a time or a full family narrative? Go back to the limiting factors. One, how much writing experience do you have? Two, how many documents do you have to write about this ancestor? And then what your limitations are. Draft everything out and then choose who am I writing for and let that be your guide. I hope that answers your questions. If you have any more follow-ups, let me know. I see that we've got quite a few people in the chat, in the viewing audience. I want to say hello to you if I haven't said hello to you already. I see that Anna Korean has popped into the chat. We're going back to Europe this summer. Andy and I have both lost about 25 to 30 pounds each. He looks great, and we're going to try to do a better time in the wife carrying competition. She has many family stories in your head, and you have yet to write them down. Anna, I'm going to give you a tip. Talk them. If they're in your head, then grab a voice recorder and just tell your stories and at least get them out of your head somewhere. And then you can turn it into an audio transcription and now it's written and then you can go back and enhance them. But that's what I would recommend that you do. Let's see. Anna Curran said, I tried a little help in Google Docs. Maybe I shall take some help of the AI. I have found the AI is better when you have started giving details to your ancestors event. In both last week's webinar here on this channel and the Roots Tech one, I showed a little bit of how to use AI. And sure, to draft it initially, it's okay, but I just found it helps tell a better story after I have gotten the details like I teach in the recipe for writing family history process. And you go through that process, then feed it to the AI, and then it'll rearrange things. But as some people said, it kind of sounds funny. So make sure you go and edit it for your own voice, but definitely it's a good help. Okay, I'm going to skip that one for now. Okay, so this is Linda. I know Linda is a big fan of the channel, so I'm going to make sure I share her question on screen. We got a lot of Lindas that like this channel, so yay to the Lindas. If you're a Linda, let me know. All right, so Linda said, what do you think of using a narrative report on an individual from Roots Magic to build a story? Now, if I remember correctly, I do have a video that talks about starting your, actually I do have that link right here. Starting with Roots Magic narrative reports and turning it into a story. So in the chat, I am putting the link and then I will later put the link in the description box. So if you're watching this later, the link is in the description box. Okay, so let me give you the short version. I do like how you can use the narrative reports to organize events chronologically and getting over that initial struggle where you're looking at a screen and there's nothing written. So the narrative reports will take all of your events and put them into the sentence structure. So you're already jumping ahead in the recipe for writing family history process. So you can do that. The one thing that's aggravating, I haven't figured out how to solve this problem, is that when you export the narrative report and then open it in a writing program, as soon as you start moving facts around, the citations do not stay linked with the fact that it was annotating in the narrative report. So, what do? You either need to initially stop and convert those citations into footnotes that are linked to text or endnotes that are linked to text before you start moving things around. And then that way, when you start writing and you start editing and rearranging things to tell a better story, that citation flow will go with it. Or you need to not export the sources, know that you have it in your Roots Magic database, rewrite the story, and then go back and cite things afterwards, because you know you have the citations, you just write and then cite. So that's the thing I'm going to tell you. Now, this is the same goes, I believe there are narrative reports for all of the genealogy program. Family Tree Maker, there's something called Gramps, I'm not sure about, Legacy Tree Maker. There's quite a few that produce these narrative reports, so don't just limit it to Roots Magic, but recognize that limitation, the biggest limitations is the sources can come over from that report, but they don't stay with the facts unless you do something about it. Okay, so that's that answer. Next question. Was there another question? I'm not understanding this comment from Stacy. Sorry. I'll probably process that later about photos. Okay. Another question. This is a good one. And if you have questions anytime during this presentation, drop it in. I don't want you to leave here and say she didn't answer my question. So pick my brain. I do have questions from earlier that I will keep going through. All right. In your experience, what is the one best source to start using while writing the way I teach you how to write here on Write Your Family History? Okay. So it kind of ties back to the question earlier about that timeline. So I won't spend too much time on it, but I really liked what Pauline said. I would start with a source that is interesting to me, because then I would be more likely to see it through. And she says, it's just me. Hey, that's me too. But I'll be honest. I've talked about this in a discussion on the channel before. I often start with the earliest record I can find about a person, only because I'm drafting the story. Remember, can't say this enough. Drafting and the final product are not the same thing. And so while there's a lot of great tips of starting in the middle, flashing back, going forward, or writing in an inverted pyramid style that's common in newspapers, where you start with the most important thing and then the least important thing, or the next most important, on all the way down to the least important thing, such as they're born. Sorry, but very few people have really great birth stories. But before we do all of those techniques, we first have to get something written. And I tend to find it easier not to start at the end with an obituary and work my way back. However, if that's what's going to start the writing juices flowing, then start there. With my German immigrant ancestor, I started with his marriage story because he was Catholic. He married a Lutheran, and a document later shows that he gave permission. I know people may find that problematic these days, but I find it quite loving that my Catholic ancestor, loved his wife enough to give her the permission she needed to keep worshiping in the faith she had. He didn't try to force her to be something she wasn't. And I love that. I do you think that's cool? I hope so. Um, and so for me, I started with their marriage story. I actually could have started with the story of their toddler drowning on their property, right? And the Catholic priest who I have a document of him berating my ancestors for not keeping an eye on their child and watch this child drowning, and then trying to give some comfort to this grieving family, but then also understand why the priest would have done that. And then I can go through and get the backstory. So, what's the one best source? There isn't any. But I will be honest, I typically go through from the earliest record. Sometimes there's a birth record. With William James Townsend, the earliest record was when he was in the 1860 census at 18 years old. So that's where I have to start. So there really isn't one best. I highly recommend that you do follow that timeline approach. Um, write, write in the document, arrange things. Maybe I shouldn't say arrange, right. Arrange things in chronological order, but put it however you want. A number of people will just put a timeline and then they can plug the stories in where they go and then figure out what's the most interesting thing to rewrite after. But I don't really have one main source. Oh, hey, Anna. Thanks for telling me what you think. I think your ancestor was great for not forcing his wife to share his fate. Yeah. Fate or faith, whatever. Um, it's not easy to marry outside of the church. That already brings some challenges there. However, what I do know about Joseph was he doesn't seem to have traveled with his family. He seems to have been a man on his own. And somehow he connects in with Caroline Mock and the Pewsakers and the Chinoffles. And there's another one that starts with an S. I can't remember. They had all migrated from Gillersheim, Hanover, Germany, to Franklin County, Ohio, specifically to the Prairie area. And they, three of the families, got property together on Mr. Kincaid's property. They didn't all stay there very long. Eventually, this was their starter home, if you will, their starter farm. Unfortunately, Joseph passed away, so I don't know if he would have stayed very long. But he lived right next door to his father-in-law and the townsfolk that his wife has traveled with. And so, if you think about this story, they were all Lutheran. They all joined this one church, but he was still Catholic. And he wasn't forced to convert. And of course, this family is adopting him in and giving him home and giving and like being neighbors with him and everything. And so it also says a lot about the Mocks, the Pewsakers, and Tunaffles to accept this Catholic into their midst, right? And so this one little line, while sometimes looking from the past, that's ridiculous. On the other hand, I find it very touching. And yeah, you did mean faith. I thought you meant faith. Okay. Um, okay. So I think I will do okay, let's go ahead. We'll go on a pretty poignant question. So if you're watching, I need you to think of a question that'll take us back from this one. It's going to be a little challenging, and you'll see what I mean here in a moment. What if you want to write about an ancestor who died of suicide according to family stories, but that there are no facts about how, when, where, why, so forth? This ancestor lived an incredibly adventurous life, and it was also interesting. There are hundreds of newspapers about her life. So, are you left with writing hypothetical possibilities of what happened to her, or what do you do? Great question, Gary. When it comes to sensitive topics, especially speculation, You need to use judgment. Previously on this channel, I interviewed Carol Baxter, and she had said, "You're the writer. You need to use your judgment on what you're going to do." I also have a webinar about sensitive stories and writing ethically. And I'm going to highly recommend that you watch that video. It's going to cover a couple of things. Be sure to share me your thoughts in the audience. Don't I love people contributing to this conversation. What would you do with a family story when it comes to suicide? I do have the link to Carol Baxter. I just keep wanting to call her Caroline. I do apologize. Carol Baxter. I do have a link to that video. And then I also think when we come to sensitive topics, we need to not pass judgment on our ancestors. And so I have that video also linked in the chat and will be in the description box later. So with that said, when you have suspicions with no proof, you have a number of options, okay? In the main body of the story, this is chapter 1 to the end of the last chapter before the back material, which includes your bibliography if you're going to use one, includes an appendix and so forth. You have a decision to make. If it's a rumor and it is one that people would like to hide under the rug, you have no way to prove or disprove, I would highly recommend that you'd not put it in the main body of the story. If that rumor hung over their head and nobody ever proved it or disproved it, but it impacted their life, then I think you need to at least mention it in the main text of the story. And while I like the box text and sidebar technique that Carol taught us about on this channel, this is one of those times that I would put it in the appendix. The appendix I tend to put for future research, stuff I still can't find, questions I still have, but I'm inviting future researchers to address. This is also where I will debunk family legends. For instance, going back to Joseph Geisler, my German immigrant ancestor, there was a story that he was shot outside of the Columbus barracks when the sentry yelled halt at him and told him to halt, and he didn't understand what that word meant. As I've discovered since that first story was told to me, halt is a word that Germans knew. And so this story, that was just the first of many problems in this story. So I debunked that story so that people, I think he died. I think there were interesting circumstances. But even though it's written down by his great-granddaughter, I just don't believe it's true. And so that's what I handled. So when it comes to this suspicion of suicidality, if all you have is people suspect she died of suicide, well, let it go. But if you have reasons to believe that she died of suicide, or there were some other things that were alleged, but you don't have any proof, but it impacted the family thereafter, take time to mention it, be gentle about it, follow the steps in the ethically writing story. But I would put it over there because if that family rumor has been around for a while, I think it's important to address it. We don't have any proof. This is my suspicion, yet I don't want you to think it actually happened, which is why it's over here, because we need to talk about it. Maybe someday in the future, this can be addressed and resolved. If not, let us be careful about the rumors we spread about our loved ones. And let's also be striving to give people the care they need so that if this was true, It doesn't happen for another loved one. So there's a lot of good that you can do with a sensitive topic that doesn't have proof. But again, put it in the appendix, treat it with compassion, and I think you will be able to be more successful that way. What do you guys think? Let me know what you guys think. This is interesting. When I asked grandma how many times she was engaged, she smiled with a smile I had not seen from her before. It was the greatest response I had ever gotten from an ancestor. Very telling. Multiple engagements, multiple marriages, multiple divorces, those can actually be sensitive topics. I do address that in the ethical webinar. If I didn't, let me know. I'll have to make it a separate video. This leads us to a question of what do we do when people don't like what we tell about them? And yet it's fact. There's a difference between writing and publishing. And when you publish, there's also where you publish. So I do have relatives that have had multiple marriages that ended in divorce. And that's part of their story. I can't change that. There are documents that document these facts. And yet I was told, don't write about that. Well, as a genealogist, I got to tell the truth. And the relative eventually found a lasting love, and it's took. But part of their story and why it's so great that they found that lasting love in the end was the unsuccessful marriages before then. And then if I can't write about the previous marriages, then I can't write about her children from her first spouse. Or which do I choose? Not only that, so I'm thinking about one of the relatives. I knew the second husband. I didn't know the first. I met the third, but I wouldn't say I knew the third. But now you're changing my memories of visiting this relative and the family by trying to hide that marriage. And so I think you got to write what it is. You got to write what it was and try to write it with compassion. But the best way to be compassionate is to be neutral. This is what happened. I can't change the fact. It is what happened. And then if that person doesn't want it shared to all the world, well, I'm not going to share it to all the world until that person passes away. I'll put copies of the family story in various archives that not everybody's going to go to find your storage, let's be honest. But I want the story recorded in case I pass away before this relative passes away. Does that make sense? But I'm not going to broadcast it and say, hey, family, I have this copy. Everybody get this copy. Because that's how I'm telling the truth, but honoring this relative. And then at some point, the truth is going to come out, and I'm going to be considered a bad genealogist if I didn't record the truth. And so that's something we need to handle. You can make multiple copies and have because in the copy I gave to this relative, I didn't include all of the marriages, but in the copy that I give to anybody else who wants, within certain parameters, I'm going to include all the marriages because the records are going to be found, right? So that's kind of something I would think about. Okay. Could we possibly find out about those who knew your ancestor and write about those relationships? I think you can, but it's going to take a lot of work and you can really go on a lot of tangents. Um, namely everybody that served with William and Milby Townsend in the Ohio 133rd. So here's my advice when you want to talk about the people that knew your relatives. Keep the research you do on them narrow unless you have documentation that says they have a more lengthy, robust relationship with them. For instance, okay, the man who served as witness to my German ancestor for his naturalization papers. I believe he was a grocer. It's all I know about him. He doesn't show up in any other records. He just was a influential man in the community. Lots of people went to him to be their character witness during the process. I'm not going to go super deep, but I'm going to where was the store? It, until generative AI makes it so that I can see how many times he served as a witness in naturalization documentation. I noticed him serving as a witness for several people during this one swearing in ceremony. And then I was like, oh, okay, he's doing this for a lot of people, but they're not connected. I already looked. So I'm going to have it very brief. Now, contrast that to my other ancestor, the one George and Emma Eveline. He had a man that he worked with, Joseph Barton. Joseph Barton is written in the family Bible. Total mystery forever until I figure out, oh, wait, this was George's son's godfather. And because of how close they were at work, the Samuel moved down the street from George, and when Samuel fell off a ladder and had a concussion and subsequently died, Eveline was the one who provided all the biographical details to the death certificate clerk, and it's all accurate. So because it's all accurate, because there's family photos of Samuel Barton's, because he was a godfather to George's son, and because they had a working relationship, I'm going to write a little bit more about this person into George's story than I would for George's grandfather's naturalization witness. Does that make sense? If you have more questions, let me know. Now, Timothy likes the fact that I say be neutral when you're writing about facts. And it is a great way to document stories. Just be neutral. Don't pass judgment on your ancestors. It is what it was. If your readers have no idea what your bias is, other than just reporting what happened, then you've done your job. Now, Carol talked about how sometimes it's going to be clear that you have a certain bias. For instance, she was talking about the ships that migrated to Australia. If you say they migrated, you have a positive bias that migration is a good thing. But if you say it was an invasion, you have a different bias because this ship is invading your country. And then a neutral would be, how do you make that neutral? Well, a ship transversed the water and landed in this new place so that people could settle. Maybe that's as neutral as it gets, right? We can't always catch our bias in that way. But if we strive to be just somebody who sits on the shoulder, follows people around, tells their story as it was, I think we're going to do a service to our ancestors. And then if they have good things about them and bad things about them, which let's face it, everybody does, we allow our readers to decide for themselves what they're going to take away from that story. Because we have drunks in our family tree. We have people who were abusers. We have people who abandoned families. I was just thinking this the other day. Let's say a man abandoned his family and went and started a new life with a new wife and had children there. Well, one way to look at it, he's such a jerk. But how often do you say, that woman, she drove him nuts. He was lucky to escape. Too bad he couldn't take the children with him. And that's something that we need to be careful. We don't know what would happen in that marriage. And so we need to just say, okay, he left his family and the wife was left to take care of the children. And this is what she did to provide for them. Right? Unless we have court cases with the battle royale in the court papers going back and forth saying, well, he did this and she did this. We just don't know. And even if we do have the records, we just don't know. So it's best for us to try to be compassionate and empathetic by being neutral. Okay. Hey, YSY Budgery, glad you're there. Haven't seen you in a while. Okay, perfect. Great point. If a person is serving as a witness several times to a couple's children's baptism, it's usually close friends or relatives. Yeah, repeat witnesses are definitely somebody to add to your ancestor stories, more than just, again, the grocer who signed off for multiple people. All right. So it is 11 o'clock. It's been about an hour. I hope you guys enjoys this. I have lots more questions to get through. So occasionally I'm going to come in and share them on the live stream. The question and answer sessions will probably only be up for 24 hours. Then I'm going to take them down because I want to put them in the playlist so that it fits whenever you want to come back and say, what about? It's just going to be a standalone video. I hope you will support those videos by, even if you don't watch it all the way through, if you just like play it and then give it a like at the end. That would be great. And leave a comment. Thank you guys for supporting me as I'm trying to restart the Right with Family History channel. Keep in touch, and we'll see you next time. Bye.